New York. The neon lights of the city painted the streets with an electric glow, while millions sat glued to their screens, anticipation thick in the air. This wasn't just another talk show episode. Tonight, history was about to be made. Inside the studio, the atmosphere was tense, charged with an unspoken intensity. At the center of the stage, beneath the piercing spotlight, two sleek leather chairs stood like silent witnesses, ready to capture the weight of the words that were about to be spoken. The audience held their breath, waiting in the eerie stillness before the storm. And then, the moment arrived. The show's renowned host turned to the camera, his signature smirk amplifying the suspense. His voice, calm yet commanding, echoed through the studio. Ladies and gentlemen, before we welcome tonight's guest, let's ask ourselves one thing. Do we really know him? A wave of curiosity rippled through the audience. The name was known to all, yet the person behind it remained a mystery. Barron Trump. A childhood spent in the White House. A life perpetually scrutinized by the media. And then silence. For years, he vanished from the public eye, leaving only whispers, speculation, and endless conspiracy theories in his wake. But through it all, he never spoke a word. Until tonight, the cameras tightened their focus. The curtain was drawn back, and the moment the world had waited for finally arrived. Barron Trump stepped onto the stage. The room fell into a hushed awe. He was different from what they had expected. His gaze held an unreadable depth, his expression devoid of nervousness or hesitation. It was as if he had always known this moment would come. With measured confidence, he strode forward and took his seat across from the host. This was it. The moment millions had anticipated. The enigmatic figure shrouded in secrecy, built up by myth, was about to speak. But what no one knew was that this wouldn't just be a conversation. This was going to be a reckoning. As the night unfolded, the truth would be revealed. And by the end of it, the world would finally know who Barron Trump truly was. The studio lights blazed brilliantly, casting a sharp glow across the stage. The audience, sipping their coffees, sat in eager anticipation of the moment that was about to unfold. The show's famous host turned to the camera with a wide grin, lowering his voice to build tension, as he always did. Tonight, we have a very special guest. Everyone knows his name. But does anyone truly know who he is? He's the son of a former president of the United States. He grew up in the White House, raised alongside one of the most powerful figures in the world. But here's the real question. Does he have his own voice? Is he here tonight with his own ideas? Or is he merely hiding behind the shadow of his legacy? A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some clapped. Others sat still, waiting in silence. The cameras panned to the stage, focusing on Barron Trump. The young man leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked onto the host. There was no sign of discomfort, no nervousness. It was as if he had always known this moment would come. The host fixed his eyes on Barron and brought his hand down onto the table with a sharp tap. "Barron, welcome," he said with a smirk. "Let's start with this. Have you ever accomplished anything on your own?" The room fell silent. The audience immediately understood the weight of the question. The host wasn't just asking, he was cornering Barron, implying that he existed only as the president's son, not as an individual. Barron met the host's gaze, pausing for a brief moment. There was no anger, no surprise, just a quiet expression of contemplation. Then, without a single word, he tilted his head slightly and smirked. That smirk should have been a warning, but the host didn't see it. "Now, don't get me wrong, Barron," the host continued. "It's great that you're here. But let's be honest. People are curious about you. So tell us, do you actually have your own thoughts? Or are you only here because of your last name?" Some in the audience smiled, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Barron inhaled slightly, his eyes still locked onto the host. He wasn't hesitating. He wasn't faltering. Then, he spoke. "Are you asking me that question? Or are you just telling me what to think?" The room froze. The silence was deafening. The host averted his gaze for a split second before forcing out a laugh-on that sounded more rehearsed than genuine. No, I'm just curious. I mean, we haven't heard you speak much. Now you're here, and everyone really wants to know who you are." Barron nodded slowly. "Is that so?" he said calmly. "Do people really want to know me? Or are they just waiting for me to fit into the narrative they've already created?" The host's eyes narrowed. The audience stirred. They were beginning to realize that this wasn't just another talk show interview. The host leaned forward. Look, Baron, this is an opportunity. You can define yourself right here, right now. But let's be honest, what have you actually done? Have you made your own decisions? Have you forged your own path? Baron Trump took a deep breath, placed his arms on the table, and leaned in ever so slightly. His eyes never left the host's. "What about you?" he asked, his voice steady. "Are you saying what you really think, or are you just playing for ratings?" A murmur swept through the audience. People exchanged glances, whispered among themselves. A few seconds of silence had transformed into one of the most powerful moments of the night. The host wasn't expecting that. His eyes widened just a fraction before he quickly tried to recover. "I asked the questions here, Baron," he said, forcing a smile. But his voice lacked the confidence it had before. Baron only smiled. Then, with the same composed tone, he responded, "And I like asking questions too." For a moment, the studio was completely still. The audience knew exactly what had just happened. Baron Trump had taken the very game the host played for years and turned it right back on him. In that instant, it became clear. Baron Trump might have been quiet, but he was never weak. The studio lights blazed with an almost blinding intensity. The audience, sipping their coffees, sat in quiet anticipation, waiting for the moment to arrive. The show's renowned host turned to the camera with a wide grin, lowering his voice deliberately to heighten the tension just as he always did. "Tonight, we have a very special guest. A name everyone knows, yet a man few truly understand. He is the son of the President of the United States. He grew up in the White House, raised alongside one of the most powerful figures in the world. But the real question is, does he have a voice of his own? Is he here on his own terms, or is he merely hiding behind the shadow he inherited?" A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Some clapped. Others simply sat in silence, waiting. The cameras shifted to reveal Baron Trump. The young man sat back in his chair, calm, unbothered, his eyes locked onto the host. There was no sign of discomfort. It was as if he had been expecting this moment all along. The host fixed his gaze on Baron and slammed his hand onto the desk. "Baron, welcome," he said with a smirk. "Let's start with this. Have you ever done anything on your own?" A hush fell over the room. The audience immediately grasped the implication. The host was cornering him, subtly suggesting that Baron was nothing more than a product of his father's legacy, that he had no identity of his own. Baron studied him for a brief moment. His eyes did not betray anger or surprise. Instead, there was something else, an air of curiosity. Then, without a word, he tilted his head slightly and offered a faint smile, a warning, though the host didn't realize it. The host pressed on. "Now, don't take this the wrong way, Baron. It's great that you're here. But let's be honest. People are curious about you. But tell me, do you actually have your own thoughts? Or are you only here because of your last name?" Some in the audience grinned. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Baron took a slow breath, his eyes unwavering. He wasn't hesitating. He wasn't stumbling over his words. Then he spoke. "Are you asking me a question, or are you telling me what to think?" A sharp silence filled the studio. The host averted his gaze, then quickly covered with a laugh forced, unnatural. No, I'm just curious. After all, we haven't really heard much from you before. And now that you're here, people want to know who you really are." Baron nodded. "Do they?" he asked calmly. "Do they really want to know me? Or are they just waiting for me to fit into the narrative they've already written?" The host locked eyes with him. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The audience realized this was no longer just a talk show segment. The host leaned forward suddenly. "Listen, Baron. This is an opportunity. You can show the world who you are. You can tell your story. But let's be honest. What have you actually done? Have you ever made a decision on your own? Have you ever walked your own path?" Baron Trump inhaled deeply. He placed his arms on the desk, leaned in slightly, and never once broke eye contact. "And what about you? Do you really believe what you say? Or are you just chasing ratings?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Heads turned, whispers spread. The silence stretched into something powerful, something unexpected. This was one of the most electrifying moments the show had ever seen. The host hadn't anticipated this response. His eyes widened slightly before he quickly recovered. "I ask the questions here, Baron," he said, forcing another smile. But his voice lacked the confidence it held just moments ago. Baron only smiled back. Then, in a measured, assured tone, he replied, And I like asking questions, too. For a moment, the studio was utterly still. The audience had just witnessed something remarkable. Baron Trump had taken the host's own game and turned it against him. And at that moment, everyone understood Baron Trump might be quiet, but he was never powerless. Baron took a brief pause, his gaze locking onto the host. There was no anger in his eyes, no surprise, just an expression of quiet analysis. A silent interrogation hidden within the spaces between carefully chosen words. Then, without a single word, he tilted his head slightly to the side. A faint, unshaded smile flickered on his lips, subtly shifting the energy in the room. It was quiet, yet impossible to ignore. That smile should have been a warning, but the host either didn't notice or chose not to. With a light tap on the desk, the host leaned in, his tone laced with challenge, with an unspoken assertion of authority. "Look, Baron, people are genuinely curious about you, but let's be honest, are you here because of your own ideas? Or are you just standing in the shadow of your last name?" A murmur rippled through the audience. A few chuckled. Others leaned back, waiting to see how Baron would respond. But Baron never broke eye contact. He drew in a slow, measured breath, as if weighing his words with precision before launching them like arrows. And then, with the calm of someone who already understood the entire game, he spoke. "Are you asking me that question? Or are you telling me what to think?" The room fell into a sharp silence. The audience exchanged glances. Some held their breath, sensing something shift. The host hesitated. For the first time, his eyes widened just slightly, but he quickly recovered, forcing out a laugh. It was light, but thinly veiled. No, I'm just curious. We haven't heard much from you. And now that you're here, everyone wants to know who you really are." Baron gave a small nod, inhaling deeply, as if turning the thought over in his mind. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice steady. "Do you truly want to know who I am? Or are you just waiting for me to say something that fits the narrative you've already decided on?" The host's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. His voice was still smooth, still playing the role, but it no longer carried the same certainty. The air in the room had changed, and the audience could feel it. He leaned forward slightly, regaining his stance. "Baron, this is your chance. You can tell your story, show the world who you are. But let's be real, what have you actually done? Have you made any decisions on your own? Have you carved out your own path?" Baron Trump exhaled slowly, placing his arms on the table. He leaned in, never once breaking eye contact. "What about you?" he asked, voice unwavering. "Do you say what you truly believe? Or are you just talking for the ratings?" A shift in the crowd. A few people fidgeted. The tension was thick, heavy. The host leaned back slightly, grasping for control. He let out a short laugh, too forced, too brittle. "I'm the one asking the questions here, Baron," he said, his smile tight. Baron merely returned the smile, but his had weight. And then, in a voice as calm as it was undeniable, he answered. "And I like asking questions, too." For a moment, the studio was utterly silent. The audience wasn't just watching a talk show anymore. They were witnessing something else entirely. Because in that moment, everyone in the room understood what had just happened. Baron Trump may have been quiet, but he was never powerless. The atmosphere in the studio had tightened like an invisible wire, humming with tension. The murmur of the audience rippled through the air, circling Baron, who sat in his chair with effortless composure. The host tapped his cue cards lightly against the desk, exuding confidence. This was his game. Years of experience had taught him what worked, pushing guests into a corner, stirring controversy, raking in ratings. And tonight, Baron Trump was his target. With a brief pause, the host scanned the crowd before turning sharply back to Baron. His voice took on a harder edge. "Let's be honest, are you here because of who you are? Or just because of your last name?" Some members of the audience held their breath. Others whispered among themselves. A few chuckled knowingly. The host stole a glance at their reaction and smirked. He was in control of the stage. Baron was merely a guest. But Baron's face betrayed nothing. His eyes, deep and steady, held the calm of an ocean before a storm. The host's words struck, but Baron didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly, watching the man before him with an almost amused expression. And then, he smiled. Just a few seconds of silence. Yet those seconds carried more weight than any laughter or applause. The host's brows creased slightly. Things weren't going as planned. Finally, Baron spoke. His voice was neither angry nor mocking, just steady, unwavering. "Are you asking me that question, or are you trying to tell me what to think?" A sharp silence fell over the studio. The audience felt the weight of his words. The host hesitated for just a moment, scanning the room. Some faces in the crowd looked stunned. It was a simple question, yet razor sharp. This wasn't a defense, it was a challenge. The host quickly composed himself. The tension in his features softened as he forced a laugh. "Oh, come on, Baron. I'm just trying to get to know you. After all, we haven't heard much from you. Now that you're here, people want to know who you really are." Baron gave a small nod, never once breaking eye contact. Then, with measured calm, he replied, "Do you really want to know me? Or are you just waiting for an answer that fits the story you've already written?" This time, a ripple moved through the crowd. The host's smile wavered for just a fraction of a second. Something had shifted. Baron was no longer just another guest that was changing the rules of the game. The host drummed his fingers against the desk. "Look, Baron, this is an opportunity. You can show people who you really are. Tell us what you've done, what decisions you've made. Be honest if you ever truly paved your own path." Baron inhaled deeply, leaning back in his chair, placing both hands on the table. Slowly, he leaned in, his gaze locking onto the host with an intensity that silenced the room. Then, with a voice as clear as it was unshaken, he asked, "And what about you? Are you saying what you really think, or are you just chasing ratings?" A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Some turned to their neighbors, whispering. Others simply stared at Baron, transfixed. The host hesitated. He was used to asking the questions, but now, for the first time, he was the one expected to answer. He tried to recover, forcing a smile. "I'm the one who asks the questions here, Baron." Baron returned the smile, but his had no pretense. And then, with quiet but unmistakable finality, he said, "And I like asking questions too." For a moment, the studio was utterly still. The audience understood what had just happened. This wasn't just an interview, it was a game of chess. And Baron Trump might be quiet, but he was never powerless. The host leaned forward suddenly, a glimmer in his eyes. "All right, Baron, let me ask you this. If you were to enter politics one day, would you follow in your father's footsteps, or would you carve an entirely different path?" The question was a carefully laid trap, and the atmosphere in the studio shifted in an instant. Just moments ago, the audience had been lounging comfortably in their seats. Now, they were leaning in, eager to catch every syllable of Baron's response. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of his expression. But Baron Trump didn't flinch. Not a single muscle on his face betrayed surprise. He let the silence stretch just long enough to seize control of the moment, then slowly shook his head. "I've never made plans for that," he said, his voice calm yet deliberate. "But I suppose the real question is this. Can people accept me for the choices I make as an individual? Or will I always just be a last name to them?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Baron's counter-question had disrupted the host's script. The host chuckled, though there was an undeniable tension in his laughter. He wasn't ready to surrender yet. "All right, let's make it simpler," he said, locking eyes with Baron. "Do you think the Trump name has given you an advantage, or has it been more of a burden?" Everyone in the room understood the game now. The host was steering Baron toward an admission either that he had been handed privilege or that he carried the weight of expectation. Either way, it was meant to box him in. But Baron Trump had already deciphered the strategy. He took a measured breath, his gaze sharpening as he responded. "Every name carries meaning," he said. "But what truly matters is whether the name defines you or you define the name." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The host faltered, his composure momentarily slipping as he processed the response. For a beat, he struggled to find the right words, but the audience had already understood. Baron Trump wasn't just answering questions, she was exposing the intent behind them. He wasn't playing the game. He was rewriting the rules. And that was something the host hadn't anticipated. A silence fell over the studio, thick and electric. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single clap rang out. Another followed. Within seconds, the entire audience erupted into applause, their appreciation swelling into a standing ovation. The host hadn't seen this coming. He leaned back slightly, forcing a tight smile. "Impressive," he said, nodding. "Truly impressive." But everyone in that studio knew the truth. Baron Trump had just transcended being a guest on a talk show. He had stepped forward as his own person, a man shaping his own story. And from that moment on, no one would see him as just a last name ever again. Throughout the entire program, Baron Trump had skillfully deflected every attack. With sharp intellect and unshakable composure, he had dismantled every trap the host had carefully set. But now, it was time to turn the game around. Leaning forward slightly, Baron locked eyes with the host. Even under the bright stage lights, his stance remained steady. His voice was calm, yet it carried an undeniable authority. "What about you?" That simple yet potent question shifted the entire atmosphere in an instant. The host, who had been dominant and aggressive just moments ago, suddenly hesitated. The audience could feel the power dynamic shifting, and they held their breath. For the first time, control was entirely in Baron's hands. The host furrowed his brows, forcing a thin smile as he tried to appear unfazed. But his voice lacked its former confidence. "What do you mean?" he asked. Baron's faint smile was akin to that of a chess player preparing to deliver the final move. "Have you spent your life truly defending your own beliefs? Or have you simply played the role that others assigned to you?" The silence in the studio was deafening. No one moved. The audience knew they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered. The host, however, had just been pushed out of his comfort zone. He had built his entire career on being the one who asked the tough questions. But now, the young man in front of him had seized control. Clearing his throat, the host forced a small chuckle. "I'm a journalist," he replied. "My job is to ask the questions." Baron nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I understand that," he said. "But does being a journalist mean asking the questions others hand you? Or does it mean truly questioning everything?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Some people smirked knowingly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The host, maintaining a professional expression, struggled to keep his grip on the conversation. But Baron's words echoed in his mind. "Baron, you're here to answer my questions," the host said, raising his voice slightly. "That's how this program works." Baron tilted his head slightly, a knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Format?" he mused. "Is that just a convenient excuse? Or is it a wall designed to keep people from truly hearing the truth?" The tension in the studio had reached its peak. The host, usually so poised and in control, now seemed at a loss for words. Baron Trump was not the figure some had assumed, a shadow lingering in the background, merely carrying the weight of a famous name. No, he was playing his own game, and he was setting his own rules. The audience had realized that this was no ordinary talk show exchange. This was something else, entirely something that would be remembered for years to come. Leaning back, Baron rested his hands on the table, never breaking eye contact. "I'm genuinely curious," he said, his voice steady. "Before asking me these questions, have you ever asked yourself?" And in that moment, perhaps for the first time, the host felt compelled to answer. The question changed everything. Just moments ago, the show had been moving along with light conversation. But now, the atmosphere was charged with something far heavier. The audience held their breath, waiting for Baron Trump's response. Even the host, typically brimming with confidence, seemed to falter for just a moment. A silence settled over the studio, not the ordinary kind, but the sort that thickened the air, pressing down on everyone in the room. The stage lights reflected off the polished set. The red recording indicators on the cameras blinked steadily, and the audience sat frozen, caught in the weight of anticipation. This was no longer just a talk show. Baron Trump didn't rush. He held the host's gaze, measuring the moment, deciding whether to answer or let silence do the talking. But he chose to speak, because now he was the one in control. If a person cannot say what they truly think, are they truly free? His words cut through the room like a blade. The audience shifted in their seats. Every eye turned to the host. Now it was he who had to answer. And there was no easy response, because Baron wasn't just defending himself. He was forcing everyone to question their own limits. The host hesitated, then tried to recover. He let out a short, uneasy chuckle, an attempt to diffuse the tension, but his voice had a slight tremor. "That's a deep question, Baron," he said. "But this is a talk show, not a philosophy debate." Baron's lips curled into a subtle smile. "Oh? So do you only expect shallow answers from your guests?" A murmur swept through the audience. Some nodded in agreement. Others chuckled, savoring the moment. Baron had seized control, not through arrogance, but through sheer composure and precision. The host kept his smile, but the tension in his jaw was unmistakable. Realizing the room had reached a boiling point, Baron leaned back slightly, took a breath, and let out a low chuckle. But I suppose such heavy questions don't exactly fit the nature of a talk show, do they? This time, the audience laughed more freely. The pressure that had been suffocating the room lifted just enough. The host, seizing the opportunity, let out a relieved chuckle and nodded along. Yet everyone knew this show had taken an unexpected turn. Barron Trump was not just another guest being asked questions. He had become the one asking them. He had reshaped the conversation, shifted the power dynamic, and taken ownership of the stage. And when the show finally wrapped up, it didn't feel like just another episode. The energy in the room lingered, heavy with unspoken thoughts, because Barron Trump hadn't just provided answers, had left behind questions that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling.